Hello and welcome back to the Get More 24 series on our YouTube channel. This series is dedicated towards following the year-long Bible reading plan that we're doing. We're reading the entire Bible from cover to cover through the calendar year of 2024. And the reason why we do that is because we believe that simply reading the Bible, really helps us better understand the flow of the narrative of the Bible and helps us understand what God is doing in his redemptive story. So reading is the constant absorption of the text, and it's for the purpose of building familiarity with the text. So we really want to become familiar with this narrative wherever we're at in the Bible so that we kind of have an idea of what's going on. We have an idea of what's happened leading up to where we are. And then we have an idea of how where we are right now flows into where we're going. So that's a few of the benefits to reading. And we distinguish between reading the Bible, studying the Bible, and meditating. All three are different approaches that yield slightly different results. So if you're interested in finding out a bit more about that, you can check out some of our other content to figure out how we navigate that. So this video is dedicated towards the book of Numbers. I've had to change my structure and how I'm doing this series. Instead of doing a video every week and having multiple videos in each book, I'm having to just kind of do one video over the entire book, just because I wasn't able to produce that many videos throughout the course of the year, unfortunately. But if you watched our videos on Exodus and Leviticus, then you kind of have an idea of what we do in these videos and kind of where this narrative is going. So now we're going to talk about Numbers. So let me go ahead and get started on what we see in the text. I'll share my screen, and then I also have some notes, so my eyes will be darting back and forth a little bit as we get into it. So the book of Numbers is kind of a complex book. It has multiple narrative threads that are all woven together into one overarching story that really propels the biblical narrative forward. So let's zoom out and rewind all the way back to Genesis. God creates, his creation's good. He creates humanity, everything's great. Humanity falls, chaos ensues, and then God begins working through this plan of redemption to restore humanity so that he can dwell with his creation once again. So that's where we kind of move through Genesis, where we have the beginning stages of this redemptive story, and then that narrative continues through Exodus. We see the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Egypt. We get introduced to this guy named Moses. He leads those descendants out of Egypt into the wilderness, and then that nation agrees to be God's covenant people and uphold the covenant standards that he gives them. And so that's what we saw in the book of Leviticus, is kind of how does Leviticus tie into this narrative? How do God's covenant people agree to the covenant? And then kind of what does the book of Leviticus talk about for the covenant, for being his people and what that purpose is? So now we're on the heels of Leviticus and we're moving into Numbers. And so what we really have here are these multiple threads woven together, these narrative threads. On the one hand, we have a thread in the book of Numbers that really chronicles God's faithfulness, specifically to Abraham. And then on the other hand, we have a thread that chronicles Israel's unfaithfulness to their covenant obligations before the Lord. And there are a couple other threads that are also present in the book, but my goal is to kind of just pick out a couple of the main key ones for this series, and eventually I'll do a more in-depth video on Numbers as a whole, and we will cover more of that information in detail. But the two that I really want to talk about today are the threads of God's faithfulness and the thread of Israel's unfaithfulness. So let's start with God's faithfulness. And the title of the book actually is a great segue. The book is called Numbers because there are a lot of numbers. And it's easy to get lost in all the numbers, but those numbers actually reveal God's faithfulness to Abraham. So let's pick up in the first chapter of Numbers and see what's going on, and then we'll figure out how it relates back to God's promise to Abraham. So in chapter 1 of Numbers, we have, I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. The Lord spoke to Moses in the tent of meeting in the wilderness of Sinai on the first day of the second month of the second year, after Israel's departure from the land of Egypt. Take a census of the entire Israelite community by their clans and their ancestral families, counting the names of every male one by one. You and Aaron are to register those who are 20 years old or more by their military divisions, everyone who can serve in Israel's army. A man from each tribe is to be with you, each one the head of his ancestral family. And then he goes in and lists, he says, these are the names of the men who are to assist you, and that, he gets that list. So Moses is commissioned with numbering the nation, doing a census, finding out, here are all the military-aged males. So in this case, it's everyone who's 20 years old and older. And why that's important, and then we go through and we actually have over the next, let's see here. By the end of chapter 1, we get the sum total of all the military-aged males. We go through tribe by tribe. You see the descendants of Reuben, the descendants of Simeon, the descendants of Gad, all the way down. And we get to the end of the 12 tribes. All the numbers are added up. The grand total is 603,550. So that's how many military-aged males, the males who are over 20 years old, are part of the community. So we've got even more people than that in the entire nation, but that's just the males 20 or older. Why is this important, and how does it reveal something about God? Well, if we think back to what God promised Abram, who later became known as Abraham, it really reveals quite a bit. So let's jump back there. We have a number of passages to look at throughout the book of Genesis to look at this promise. And we're going to start in Genesis 12, where we kind of meet the character of Abram within the narrative. So Genesis 12:1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." So he says this to an individual man who we later find out has no kids at this point. And he says, "I will make you into a great nation." Well, I mean, obviously nation is plurality. You have more than one person. But right now, Abram is just one person. Now we're going to jump down to chapter 13 and look at verses 14 through 17. After Lot had separated from him, that is Abram, after Lot had separated from Abram, the Lord said to Abram, "Look from the place where you are. Look north and south, east and west, for I will give you and your offspring forever all the land that you see. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up and walk around the land. Get up and walk around the land through its length and its width, for I will give it to you." So now we have God's giving a bit more details about what he had originally told him back in chapter 12. Now it's your offspring, and there's going to be a great multitude of your offspring. It's going to be like counting the dust of the earth. Again, Abram doesn't have any kids at this point. So now let's jump down to chapter 15 in Genesis. Same thing. And I'm not going to read this entire section because it's 15 verses 1 through 21, but I want to read just a few. We're going to read verses 2 through 7 and then 13 through 16. So again, God approaches, he meets with Abram, and he says, he tells Abram not to be afraid. I'm your shield, and your reward will be very great. But Abram said, "Lord God, what can you give me, since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?" Abram continued, Look, you've given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now the word of the Lord came to him, this one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars. If you are able to count them, then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So again, we have more details. Not only is Abram going to have descendants, right? But it's not even going to come through adopted descendants. The descendants will come from his own body, right? He is going to father children. Again, he has no children at this point. Now let's jump down to 13 through 16, because this gets even more interesting, and it ties in a bit even more specifically with numbers. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. Genesis 15, 13 through 16 is incredibly important. And we can't really overstate that, specifically as we look at the Exodus account and then where we're at in the book of Numbers. So the Lord has promised descendants to this man Abram, physical descendants from him. He will father children. Then the Lord says, hey, the children you father, they are going to be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that doesn't belong to them. They're going to be enslaved and oppressed, but don't worry, I'm going to bring them out through mighty acts, and they will actually plunder the nation that was oppressing them. And we see that's exactly what happened. Abram's grandson, Jacob, goes down to Egypt with the 70 members of his household. And then that whole household, all the descendants of Abram, are living in Egypt for 400 years. They eventually become enslaved in Egypt, and then God delivers them through Moses in the Exodus account. And as they're departing from Egypt, they plunder the Egyptians and take valuables. So we see some very specific things happening, and those things actually happen. So now we want to, let's see, let me double check. There's one other passage I have here, and I want to see if I read it or not. No, I'm not actually going to read that because it's kind of a reiteration of what we've already talked about. But the other passage that I have is Genesis 17, 1 through 8. And so that is another reiteration of God making this promise. But let's jump forward back to Numbers because that's ultimately where we're at in our narrative. So we see this promise to Abram. We see the details are getting more and more specific. And God is being faithful to what he's promised. He promised descendants. He delivered a descendant to Abram named Isaac. And then Isaac fathered Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob fathered 12 sons. And then those 12 sons fathered children. And they just continued to grow and grow and grow and grow. They went and lived in Egypt for 400 years. They were enslaved and oppressed. They left Egypt. And now they're at the foot of Mount Sinai. They've agreed to be God's covenant people and uphold the covenant obligations. And so we see the first half of this promise to Abram being completed. The promise being, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bring your descendants back to this land. His descendants have become a great nation, and they're en route to going back to that land. So the census, while it can be kind of overwhelming and easy to get lost in the book of Numbers, it's really important, and it communicates a lot of valuable things about who God is. He's faithful. He's been faithful, and we can see up at this point, if we kind of forget the rest of how the narrative plays out, if we just focus on where the narrative is in Numbers, we can see how God has been faithful from the point of delivering the promise to Abram to the counting of the 12 tribes here at the base of Mount Sinai. So that's kind of the first thread, is God's very faithful, and we can see this in Numbers and how it ties in with the preceding material. Now let's shift gears and look at Israel's unfaithfulness. And the book of Numbers has a ton of examples as to how Israel was unfaithful, and we're only going to look at a few. I'm not going to read every single example because we'd end up reading, 70% of the book. But a few of the ways that Israel's unfaithful, and it kind of starts slowly and progressively gets worse. So we're going to examine that build up a little bit. So what we need to realize is that for the first 10 chapters of Numbers, Israel is still at the base of Mount Sinai. They haven't departed yet. So they're not going anywhere. They're still at Mount Sinai, and they're making their final preparations to being God's covenant people. And once those final preparations are made, then they can actually depart and start fulfilling that second part of God's promise, which is entering the land. So that's what we kind of need to have in our minds. The first 10 chapters, we're still making those final preparations. And a large part of that is the census and organizing the nation into kind of a military regiment, because they're not entering an empty land, they're entering an occupied land. And we saw that back in Genesis 15, that really important section I said, in 15 verses 13 through 16, in that God says, because the iniquity of, I think it's the Amorites, has not yet reached their boiling point, completion. So there are multiple things going on, but ultimately God is using the nation of Israel as a instrument of judgment against the nations of the land that he's giving Israel. So we have all this preparation in the first 10 chapters. Then let me jump ahead to 11. Now all of a sudden we start to see Israel deviating from God. Now remember, go back and watch that video on Leviticus if you haven't, because I chronicle how the nation of Israel agreed to be God's covenant people. And we actually see that agreement being made back in Exodus 19. So they've agreed to be God's covenant people. They make all their preparations. They're actually being obedient. And the second they depart and they start leaving, now all of a sudden we see them start to grumble and complain. And the grumbling turns into disobedience, and the disobedience turns into outright rebellion. So we're going to look at that. So Numbers 11, verses 1 through 3. Now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. When the Lord heard, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. Then the people cried out to Moses, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So that place was named Taberah, because the Lord's fire had blazed among them. So this is the first of many examples, but it's kind of a seed example, meaning that it sets the course for disobedience, but there are greater ways in which Israel's disobedience kind of becomes full measure. This is just kind of their disobedience in infancy stage. So they're grumbling, they're complaining, and then so first they're complaining about traveling and just hardship. Then they start complaining about food. We see that in Numbers 11:4 and following. We see this complaint about food. Then we have in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, who are Moses' siblings. They confront Moses, and they're like, hang on, you're getting out of line here, dude. Like, we're just as holy as you are, and, all this stuff. And there's this big confrontation between Moses and his siblings. And then we kind of hit this big landmark moment in chapter 13 that I want to talk about. And that is, God tells Moses to send out spies into the land of Canaan, the land that they're going to take. and there's one spy from each tribe, so there are 12, and they're supposed to go out, observe the land, and come back and bring a report. So they go out, they observe the land, they come back, but they bring back a very negative report. And they basically say, hey, we should not go into this land. We can't do this. And 10 out of the 12 give this unfavorable report, and 2 of the 12 give a favorable report, and those 2 are Joshua and Caleb. And ultimately what happens here is it's this hinge moment where the nation could move forward in faithfulness to God's covenant, but they choose not to. They rebel and they're disobedient. And ultimately what we see here is outright rebellion. And the 2 spies who give a favorable report, they actually try to be like, no, wait, like, guys, we can do this. And the nation turns on them and is getting ready to stone them. And that's in chapter 14. And so let's look at that really quick. The whole community threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tent of meeting. So we have this whole kind of confrontation, this whole like, no, we shouldn't go into the land. No, we should go into the land. And then basically everyone's like, no, we're not going into the land. We're going to actually choose to go back to Egypt because it would have been better for us to go back to Egypt. And we're going to stone you guys who say that we actually should go into the land. And then the Lord kind of comes down and intercedes and makes his presence known. And then we have a really sad verse that kind of sums up this whole negative report of the land, the rebellion about not entering the land, them saying that they were actually better off in Egypt. All of these things crescendo into chapter 14, verse 11, where the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people despise me? How long will they not trust in me despite all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them with a plague and destroy them. Then I will make you into a greater and mightier nation than they are. So the Lord's really had it with Israel's unfaithfulness. And we hit this point where it's like, we see this thread where God's been faithful to the promise that he made to Abraham, and he's been faithful to that for hundreds of years. And we see Israel kind of at the first moment, the first opportunity where their faith is tested, where they actually have to move forward in their faith, despite unfavorable circumstances, they crumble and fold. And God's assessment of this, of how this is built, is how long will these people despise me? And so we see this really tragic hinge moment in the narrative. And basically the rest of the narrative for the book of Numbers is very unfavorable for the nation of Israel. They end up wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. All of the people 20 years old and older who left the land of Egypt in the Exodus event, none of them saw the promised land. They all died in the wilderness because God was like, look, you guys said you were better off in Egypt, and then eventually you're going to say that you would have been better off dying in the wilderness, so you're going to die in the wilderness. You're not going to enter the land. And that's really where the book of Numbers goes. The thread of Israel's unfaithfulness competes against the thread of God's faithfulness. And, we see a clash there. And ultimately, they spend 39 more years in the wilderness than they needed to. And the people who left Egypt in the Exodus never actually enter into the land. And so that's how that narrative continues to build and grow. But the overarching narrative of God's redemptive plan is propelled forward, because the children of that rebellious generation, they are going to enter the land. And so we conclude the book of Numbers with this new generation being raised and them kind of getting to the point of being commissioned to do what their parents failed to do. And that's where the book of Numbers ends and kind of propels us forward into the book of Deuteronomy. So there's a lot of great stuff in Numbers. The narrative can be kind of tough to follow because, like I said, there are a lot of competing threads, and we only really covered 2 of them. But that's what we've got going on. We are pushing that narrative forward, but it can be tough to track. And that's why we want to read. Because reading, as we constantly absorb the text and we cover ground in the text so that we just become more familiar with that narrative, we're able to track and see how these things thread together. So that's why reading is so valuable, and why I would encourage you, if you've never read the entire Bible, or if you've never specifically read Numbers or the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, I'd encourage you to just sit down and read those, and just make note of your observations, but don't pursue any rabbit trails. Just focus on reading and enjoying the narrative and becoming familiar with the narrative. And the more you do that, you'd be amazed at how much you actually pick up and glean, and how much more familiar you are with the text, and how actually the Bible becomes demystified. And that's ultimately what we're striving to do here at Get More Ministries. We want to demystify the Bible so people can become more familiar with it and they can grow closer to God through it. And our approach to that is helping people read the Bible, helping them study the Bible, and helping them meditate, and then combining all 3 of those engagement strategies together to get more of who God is through His Word. So if you like this, stay tuned, because I'm going to be doing, kind of tracing this narrative throughout the entire Bible for each book, or maybe a few of the books. As we approach some of the shorter ones, I might combine a few of them together. But that's what this series is dedicated towards. It's supposed to kind of complement reading through the Bible over the course of a year. So that's the book of Numbers. Pick it up, read it. I encourage you to dive into it. It's really good stuff. And I will see you in the next video covering the book of Deuteronomy. Happy Bibling.